This is Kyle Stallings. It's March 8th, 2023. We're here today at the Tomball Museum at the Oil Camp House. We're here with Ms. Eileen Allen. And this is part of the museum's Oral History Project, recording recollections of the Tomball residents, especially the ones who have shaped and formed the history of this great town in northwest Harris County. You can view this video and others at our YouTube channel at Tomball Museum. Thanks for joining us. Ms. Allen, we wanted to ask you about your memories today. What's your full name for us today?
My full name, excuse me, is Audrey Eileen Bradicum Allen.
And when were you born?
November 21st, 1934.
Where were you born?
In Houston.
Do you remember which hospital or place?
Parkview.
Parkview Hospital.
Small little hospital out on Harrisburg.
Great. I wanted to start, if you could, I made this little chart, and we might use part of this, but I wanted to understand the Bradicums in the Tomball area. And do you first know how the Bradicums came to our area?
Yes. My grandfather, Frederick Bradicum, his parents, a brother George, his sister Rosa. Oh, and my goodness, I can't remember the other sister right now. But anyway, she was a Seidel. Rosa became a Cobes. Those 4 children came with their parents and on a boat from Germany and landed in Galveston in the 1800s. And I think they were so tired of being on that boat, they just came to the closest little place, a farming community, and settled there as tenant farmers and raised their family there. And then shall I go on?
Well, I wanted to stop you there. Do you know where they came from in Germany?
We understand they came from Waldeck, Germany. That's our understanding. One of my cousins went a few years ago with his family to visit there, could not find the name any place on the records there. But that's what we were always told, that they came from that area, from the Waldeck area in Germany.
Great. And that was Friedrich.
Yes,
he
Friedrich.
was one of the sons who came over?
That's right. My grandfather was Friedrich.
And then he was your grandfather?
My grandfather.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. And who was your grandmother?
My grandmother was Mary Elizabeth Heaton. She was previously Mary Elizabeth Heaton. Well, I'm sorry. She was Mary Elizabeth Heaton Miller. She had been married to Mr. Miller, and they had 3 children. And she was widowed when she met my grandfather, who was widowed also, with children.
And after that, she later became Mary Delaney, is that right?
Later, after my grandfather passed away, then she married Mr. Burl Delaney, yes.
All right. So their children, one was George Frank Bradicum, is that right?
That's right. And his brother, Christoph.
Did they have any other siblings?
Well, my grandmother had a total of 10 children, but those were all, of course, half-brothers and sisters of my dad and his brother. He and his brother were the only 2 from my grandmother and grandfather's marriage.
All right. So did Christoph live around this area?
Yes, he lived in Pinehurst. Yes, yes.
What did he do?
He had a he had a grocery store there in Pinehurst, gas station, and then he had he was involved in the oil field supplies that they used when they were doing the oil boom out in that Montgomery County area there around Pinehurst.
Do you remember Christoph's wife's name?
Her name was Annie Mae Evans Heaton. I'm sorry. All right, my aunt Annie Mae Evans Bradicum. She was an Evans, yes.
She was married to Christoph.
And married to Christoph,
Did
yes.
they have children?
Yes, they had a daughter, Billy Mae Hardy, and their other daughter was Maureen.
Your dad was Frank Bradicum?
That's correct.
And his name was George Frank Bradicum?
That's correct.
And what was his wife's name?
Her name was Vera Dudley Bradicum.
And how many children did they have?
Just one.
And that was you?
That was me.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yes.
And I wanted, before we go back into your family, to go over on the G.W. Bradicum side.
Yes.
So, was it an earlier wife of Friedrich Bradicum that was Rosa Baumgartner?
Yes.
All right.
Correct.
And they had Gottlieb Walter Bradicum?
That's correct.
And most people around Tomball, what do they call him?
G.W.
G.W.?
G.W. Yes.
And I wondered about that. I heard a lot of people around Tomball went by just their initials.
Mm-hmm.
Was that just the Tomball tradition, or was that just the time back then?
I really don't know about that. I would say maybe just the time, maybe. I would think. Just, that uncle was quite a special person. He had so many stories to tell. And I think that his stories were recorded by his daughter, too, because he knew your grandfather very well. He was a rancher. Walter was a rancher, had a little farm out in Decker Prairie. And so, of course, he was associated with your grandfather, Mr. B. Stallings, who was a dairyman. And so they were closely connected in their past history.
Great. So did G.W. Bradicum have any siblings?
G.W. had a twin, but I understand that twin was stillborn. So he was the only child, as far as I know, from Rosa and Frederick. Yes.
Right. And what was his wife's name?
His wife's name was Lily Freilich.
She was from the Rose Hill area?
From the Rose Hill area, yes.
Do you know who her parents were?
I don't know her history. I surely don't.
All right. And their children?
Children were Evelyn and Lonnie or Lawrence, Victor, and also Vernon. Thanks for that.
Yeah. And are there still children and grandchildren of them around the area?
Yes. Evelyn's son is a doctor in Austin, probably retired by now. Her daughter, Gail, lives in the San Antonio area. She's a retired teacher. And Bernie has a daughter here in Tomball. Also, Victor has a grandson, probably a great-grandson, and his name is Friedrich.
Great.
Yes.
So what did Mr. G.W. Bradicum do in Tomball area?
He had a grocery store here in town, IGA store, and they lived above the store. Their store was there on East Main, or just before you cross the track, and very convenient location. And post office was nearby too. And
was the post office across the street?
It was. I think though it had been right in the same block, kind of adjacent to the store for a while, in a frame building, and then it was moved across the street into the brick building there on the corner. Yeah, and that had also been the telephone office at one time.
Interesting. So, where did G.W. Bradicum live in their family?
He had a farm there in Decker Prairie, and it's still there. They've just sold it, though, and now it has become two different subdivisions. They're building houses on that.
Roughly where was that?
That would be at the corner of, well, it would be on Decker Prairie, Rose Hill Road, near the old Baker Cemetery. Children and grandchildren also lived on that farm. Mm-hmm. And possibly some of the family is still living on that land.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I had this from one of the Tomball books. This was the Diamond Jubilee book, a tribute to Tomball. And it showed, is that the store where G.W. Bradicum?
Yes, it is.
Great.
It surely is.
A good little history of his family.
Yes. That's
and
good, yes.
I had this one from Frank Bradigan family.
Okay. Yes.
And what did Frank Bradigan do around the Tomball area?
Well, he began as high school principal in Tomball. He had previously taught in Dobbin and in Huffman, and also in Klein, where he was first superintendent of Klein School District. And then I think it was your grandfather that came and approached him about coming to Tomball as high school principal. So came here, and he and my mother both were in the education field. So they were involved in school and education for about 20 years. And then they retired from that, and my mother started a little gift shop. And my dad was school tax assessor and collector. And then she decided she wanted to enlarge her little business, and so they built a store on Main Street, and it became known as Bradigan's Department Store. Started out as a little variety store, and then it just kind of grew. And my dad then helped her, kept books for the store, and so that was a wonderful life. They really, really loved being in the store, meeting people, because people would come in from all areas to trade there at the store. They carried clothing and household goods and toys. It was just a very little store, and so it was an enjoyable time for them before they retired.
Did they have like a big table in one area where you laid out fabrics for people to buy fabrics?
Yes, that was my mother's love. She liked to sew, and she, as they grew in their business, she added fabric and notions of, to sew with thread and snaps and all kinds of scissors. And yes, that's what they would do. They would put the material out so they could cut the material when ladies would come in to shop. Yes.
Remember any other high school friends or high school teachers or stories about high school you want to share with me?
Well, I remember that we would ride the bus over to the campus over on Cherry Street, because that's where the cafeteria was. And I said, that's where I learned to really eat fast, because by the time you'd get over there and then get your lunch and then jump back on the bus and get back to school, so you had to hurry to eat. And I remember other friends. There was Shirley and Millard Ford, who were sweethearts and then later married. There were the Cannon children, Geraldine and Gerald, who were in our youth group at church. And Gerald later became a pastor, and Geraldine married Sam Smart, and they lived here in Tomball and had their family here for a long, long time. Cannon families were a sweet, sweet family in our church. Really enjoy thinking back about memories of them.
And which church were you going to when you were in high school grade?
We attended First Baptist Church, and when we were living here in Tomball, my parents lived in a home on Pine and Mason, as I said, and so the church was right there, adjacent to, right across the street from our house. And so we spent a lot of time at church. We were there on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and sometimes even went over and played in the churchyard. And also, our pastor, Brother McGowan, and his wife lived there next door to the church, and I was in and out of their house just like it was part of my house. I just kind of like grandparents, and just a precious family that I remembered being there.
And part of this sounded like your family was involved in establishing First Baptist Church. Is that right?
Yes, my grandmother, my mother's mother, Mrs. Dudley, she was so concerned, because when they attended church back when my mother was a teenager, they did not have a pastor, a full-time pastor. And the pastor would come through maybe once a month. And so the Baptist and the Methodist church kind of met together and worshiped together. And my grandmother was very concerned about that. And so one night she went to a meeting over in Waller and talked with the minister over there about could they find someone who would come to Tomball full time and serve there as the pastor. And so eventually that happened, and so that was the beginning of First Baptist.
Great.
Yes.
And who was your first son?
Our first son is William Barrett, as he was well known as, but not well known necessarily, but as known as Barrett. Yes.
I found this. It's not a very good printing of the photo, but this was on one of the Facebook pages recently.
Yes. Yes.
Who were in that?
All right. Of course, that I'm standing here, and this is my husband Bill over here, and this is our firstborn Barrett, and that's our little Ford, and this was on Main Street, and you can. These buildings are still standing on Main Street. And here's the Winona Theater right back over here, just the edge of it, which burned. Yes.
Wonderful. And that looks like it's roughly in the 50s. Sometime.
Yes, it was in the 50s. He was born in 51.
1951. Great. And he was still looking pretty small then. Maybe.
Yeah, just a little guy.
Maybe this was 1952 or so. That's interesting.
Yes, probably so. Yeah. Right.
And who were your other children?
All right. We later had a son by the name of Stephen Douglas, and he lives here in Tomball, has stayed right here. And then our last child was a little girl, Lori Kay, Shannon now, and she resides in Lake Jackson. Barrett passed away in 2018. And he has two precious children and a little grandson. And they live in the Clear Lake area. And his wife, Marcia, is still living, and she's in Friendswood. So.
Wonderful. And did y'all mostly live in Tomball or always in Tomball?
Well, with Bill went to work for Humble Company. And so you know how oil companies are, they kind of transfer you around. And so we were transferred to Katy, and then we were transferred back to Tomball, then down to South Texas in Refugio, then back to Katy, and then back to Tomball. So we have moved around quite a bit, but stayed pretty much right here in Texas. Yes.
Do you remember when y'all moved back to Tomball the last time?
Yes, we had, Bill and I had bought a little place down in Rockport, and were there a few years, I guess about 10 years, enjoyed, so he could go fishing, because he loved fishing. And so we lived there in Rockport about 10 years and came back here, and it was just the most natural thing in the world to come back to Tomball, because this is where family and friends lived, and we were so glad to come back here. I was so happy to be back in Tomball. Yes.
So, what did your husband do for Humble Company?
Well, he worked in their gas plants. Yes, he worked in their gas plants. Yes.
All right. We had some people talking about the Tomball gas plant here. Did he run that for a while?
He did. He worked there in that plant. He surely did. Katy gas plant was a big plant.
Dan Nicholson was telling us about the whistle that they had, that they would blow the lunchtime whistle. Do you remember that?
I don't, because we actually didn't live in the camp here in Tomball. We always lived, when we came back here, we were here a very short time before we were transferred back down to South Texas. So we were living with my parents. It was just before our son was born, and so I was having some problems, and so we were living with them. So we never did actually have a house in the camp. So I don't remember, but I think I do recall that they did blow that whistle. Yes,
Good.
Yes.
Do you remember what buildings these are in this photo? Do you recognize them?
Yes, this building right here was built by Mr. and Mrs. Ball. It had been Dr. Graham, Dr. Graham had an office. I mean, his first office was in this building. There was a beauty shop here. The Balls lived upstairs. And I remember talking with Billy Ball one day, and he said, you know, Main Street was my front yard. And he had a lot of memories of just playing up and down the street in Tomball. Yes.
Do you know if their family was any kin to Thomas Ball that the town is named after?
I don't know that. I do not know that. I'd never heard that that was the case. Surely don't.
And roughly where is that building today? Do you know?
That building would be 400 block, I'm going to say. And I don't know, Pine would be on this side.
Further west.
Yes, west of that. And then, because this building is facing north here. And I'm not sure what that street, I don't remember the name. It's a tree, of course, because all of our streets are named for trees that run north and south.
Winona was there close
Yes.
to Nobby's Barbershop?
Right, exactly. Nobby's Barbershop then was just the other side
Just a
of the
little bit
theater.
further west.
Right.
Great. So, I heard that you played for many years in the church, the organ and the piano.
Yes, I did. Enjoyed getting to do that. That was a special thing. Play the organ and here at First Baptist, and then later when we were in Rockport, I got to play keyboard down there. So I've always enjoyed music. My Aunt Pearl taught me piano.
What was her name?
Her name was Pearl Dudley Dale, D-A-L-E, yes. And she was a little widowed lady, and my great-grandfather lived with her there in her little home, and it was probably along about Market Street, just off of Main Street. And she had a nice little house there, and she had roomers. She had a little garage apartment. She would rent rooms to the teachers who needed a place to stay. And she taught music and attended First Methodist and played the piano there at First Methodist.
Do you remember when you started taking lessons from her?
Well, she always said, I won't start a child teaching a child piano until they're at least first grade, because they need to learn to count and they need to know their letters. So that's when I started taking lessons when I was about 7.
Have you played ever since then?
Yes, still like to. Still get to play at church for Sunday school. Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes.
I was remembering back when I was a kid. I remember at First Baptist having snow cones for the
Vacation.
summertime
Vacation Bible school. Yes.
And it sounded like your family spent a lot of times there too.
Yes, we surely did. I remember going to church when I was a kid, sitting with my friends, passing notes like kids do in church a lot of times. Don't remember listening very well sometimes to what the pastor was saying. Then later on as a youth, we always had like a Saturday youth night. And so our kids would gather and we'd have a devotional time and sing songs, and then we'd go and we'd have refreshments. Maybe we would have, maybe even spaghetti. Sometimes they would feed us, a nice little meal. And then playing volleyball afterwards, out in the churchyard. And then just playing games. We had a really, really sweet, most godly man who was our youth minister at the time. His name was John Fisher. And he was the most selfless person I think I've ever known. And sweet memories about our time as youth. He made certain that we had some wonderful experiences. He would take us to, there was a gathering of young people, college-age kids, and he took us one time to Waco, I believe it was, and it was the Baptist Student Union, and we had some really wonderful times. We had visiting ministers, young preachers who were still in seminary, and he would invite them to come, and we had some wonderful, wonderful speakers and wonderful times of hearing the Word when I was a young person. Well, I do remember a building that was on the corner of Cherry and Main Street, across from the bank. Guarantee Bond State Bank was on the corner there by Klein's grocery store. And then across the street, just east of that, was the store. Mr. Terrell ran that store, and it was a dry goods store. And it was a place that you went in to buy your material or any apparel that you might need. And then later on, the Coleman family bought that store, that business, and ran that business until they retired. And I remember Juanita Coleman Parker, who is one of our school teachers, married to Polly Parker, another of our teachers. That was the store that her parents owned. Yeah.
I remember Miss Parker was a nurse there at our elementary school when I was there.
That's another Parker, Johnny Parker.
Okay,
Johnny Parker, yes. She was married to Mr. Adolph Parker. He was one of our Humble hands. He worked for Humble Company, but Johnny, yes, was our school nurse there for many years. Such a precious lady, yes. And that couple met when they were in service in World War II, overseas, I think.
Miss Parker was nursing back then?
Yes, she was a nurse. Yes, she was a nurse during World War II. Yes, as I recall, if I think I have my story straight.
Great.
Yes.
Any other businesses around town that bring memories back?
I remember Mr. Swanson had a cafe in town. We always loved to go there and eat. And it was there for many, many years. Mr. and Mrs. Joe Sebesta had a restaurant also across the street, and that was a great place to eat. My Uncle Walter's store, it was kind of like an old-time grocery store, but he also had some dry goods too. And then, of course, Klein's, his big competitor, had the grocery store with a nice dry goods area too, additional to that in that business. I remember Mr. Jack Beard had a service station on the corner. Then across the street was the Exxon station, or Humble station, owned by Everett Nicole. And before that, I think it was owned by maybe Mr. Hardy Gillum, possibly. That's an old name here in town. Yeah.
Wonderful. So Mr. G.W. Bradigan's store, I remember his wood floor.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And when you'd walk in, you'd have the wood shelves lined up. And
yes.
then way in the back had the meat counter.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And one of the, when I was pretty young back then, but I remember the most fun was that screen door.
Yeah.
Going in and out the screen door.
Yeah, you can hear that banging, can't you still?
Yeah.
Right, yes.
So, and I've heard people talking about the meat locker in the back of the store. Do you remember anything about that?
Right. I don't remember. We never did use the meat locker. We just bought what we needed, day by day. Yeah. And one of the things that I think about, too, as a child, Mother would give me a little purse, and she'd say, go down to Uncle Walter's and get some bread, or go down and, pick up this or that. And I was allowed to walk those blocks by myself down to Uncle Walter's and do a little bit of shopping that needed to be done. And so that was another thing that made me just appreciate my childhood, because we were safe. We were always safe. Nothing ever went wrong, it seemed like, in our little town. Mr. Hooker, that's another person that I would remember, another family, was our night watchman. And he would go around town all night long, making certain that all the doors were locked and everybody was okay and nothing was out of the way.
Was that Herschel Hooker? Or his
that
dad?
was his dad, Herschel Hooker, who was our war hero. Yes, that was his father.
Do you remember his father's name?
Right now, I do not remember his first name. He was just a sweet man, very sweet man. Mm-hmm.
What stories do you remember about Herschel?
Oh, I just remember hearing about Herschel being such a hero during the war, and he had a mustache, and they called him Handlebar Hank. Now that's just, I never called him that, but I remember that was just a name that he was given. And I would like to share a memory that I have about our town. I believe it was probably just before D-Day during World War II. And I remember that the town came together down at the intersection of Cherry and Main Street, out in the middle of the street, because there wasn't that much traffic then. And we gathered there, all the people of the town, and prayed before that battle for our young men as they went into war. And oh, what a thankful feeling we all had when that war was over and our boys came home. And many lost their lives, but we're so thankful for the service of those people, those young men that gave up their lives to go fight in that war. And I remember as children, we would buy savings stamps at school to help the war effort. We would, and the rationing that things that we had to do without during the war, there was a rationing of the gas. You couldn't just go down and fill up. You had to have coupons or stamps to go and be able to buy gas. You couldn't buy tires. You could not. A lot of food was rationed: meat, canned goods, sugar, and that was a difficult time for our nation. But it's a resilient nation.
Let's go back to the Tomball camp a little bit. Do you remember any stories or personnel or people that you recall from that Tomball camp days?
Okay, there was, of course, the Nicholson family, and they were good friends of my husband's folks. Howard and Leona Allen were good friends with Mr. Nicholson and his wife. And
what did Howard Allen do in the Tomball camp? Do you remember?
Well, now, actually, he worked for another oil company, a small oil company by the name of Josie Oil. And their lease was out in the Rose Hill area near Spring Creek. And the company house that they lived in is still standing out there. And
you remember roughly where?
Yes, it was north of the Salem Lutheran Church. That road, of course, is the one that comes out, the church road that comes, and then that road kind of dead ends there, and it makes a turn and goes west, and you would circle around and you'd come into their old parish hall of the Lutheran Church of Salem Lutheran, and it was kind of behind, and then the Bisher family lived next door there, and Mr. Bisher was one of the teachers at the school. And so they had their school back there. The Lutheran school was back there behind that. And so Mr. and Mrs. Allen's home sat further north. It was across a pasture there and near the creek. And that's where my husband loved to fish and hunt as a child.
Did your husband have any siblings in the area?
Yes, he had two sisters, Colleen and Louise. They're both deceased, and but oh my, he spent a wonderful childhood living in the woods, just being able to run around out there like little boys like to do.
That's very close to the Petricks.
Yes, the Petrick, yes.
Were they neighbors? Or
they were neighbors, yes, they were neighbors, and oh my, a lot of tales about Mr. and Miss Petrick, and they were just a sweet old couple that lived close by there, and Bill loved to go down there and visit with them when he was a kid. Yes. Out at the big camp, the upper camp, as it was called, that was such a precious place because the houses were built kind of in a circle, and out in the center they had playground equipment. They had slides and swings and seesaws, and so it was just a paradise for children. And of course, everybody had children out there. And those were good memories, yes. The ladies there formed the Tomball Study Club, and so that was one of the really fine organizations, I guess you might say, that came out of camp life, too. I don't know if any of the other Tomball facilities had organizations like that or not, but Mrs. Niccolo, Miss George Niccolo, whose husband was the superintendent overall, Mrs. Chenault, Mrs. Bruce, all of those ladies were members of the study club, and that's where that began. Yes.
It first was the Tomball Study Club. Did it later become the Tomball Study Club?
It later became Tomball Study Club. Yes.
Great.
Right.
What's your most memorable event growing up in the Tomball area?
Well, I'm just going to go back and say that prayer meeting out there in the middle of that street, I think, was one of my most precious memories, I think. Other than being a part of what went on in our church and then at school, any particular other memories that just stand out, right now I don't. But to me, that's a very special memory that our town came together to pray.
What's the first type of cars or vehicles you remember around the Tomball area?
I remember my dad's car. My first memory of our car was a black Ford. He was a Ford man. He liked that make, and it had to be black. Always had to be black. So Dad had a number of black cars. He finally ended up with a Chrysler, though. But yes, I always remember the black Ford, and it was just a sedan. It didn't have two doors. It wasn't a four-door car. It only had the two doors, and so you crawled between the seats to get into the back seat. And I can remember we'd go somewhere and we'd come home in the evening late, and I'd say, "Can you just drive down the street one more time?" And they would drive down to Drag Main and go down to the railroad track and turn around, come back, and then we'd go home. So that was, and enjoyed just riding in the car and going to visit relatives on Sunday afternoon. That was what you did. You just went to visit the aunts and uncles and the cousins, and those were special memories. Being in the car, and my mom and dad liked to sing, and when we were in the car, we were singing, and so I learned a lot of old songs just listening to them sing. And they would harmonize, and I liked that.
Your grandmother, Mary Heaton?
Uh-huh.
Where was her Heaton family from? Do you know much about them?
I understand they came down from Arkansas. Her father came down from Arkansas, and they stopped off in near Salado, and he met his wife, and she was a Holland. And they married, and then they came on down. I understand. I guess they came from there onto the Decker Prairie area. My grandmother's brother, Mr. Newton Heaton, Jasper Newton Heaton, lived in Decker Prairie. Her sister, Kanzadi O'Neill Baker Heaton, Baker O'Neill, I think that was the way it was, lived there in Decker Prairie too. So that was just the place that they all seemed to settle in, and he raised his family, I guess, in that area. And his last days, I understand, were he lived with my Uncle Christoph in Pinehurst. We have pictures of him in his later years, right before he passed away.
And how about your mother, Vera Dudley? Where did their family was here in Tomball as well?
Yes, actually, they were from over in Alabama, and they came over. My grandfather, Frank Dudley, and his family had a number of brothers and sisters, and they moved from Alabama to Texas, and I don't know what years that would have been, but they settled kind of in the Bay City area, and then kind of migrated to Addicks, where my grandfather and grandmother lived, and my mother went to school in Addicks, and she became friends there in Addicks with a sweet lady, Selma Beckendorf, who was Elmer's mom. I don't know her maiden name, but she and my mom were good friends when they were just children in school in Addicks. And then later they moved into Houston. My grandfather was a jack of all trades. He kind of dairied some, so he would haul milk into Houston from Addicts area, and on the way he passed through Camp Logan, which was a military camp during World War I. And so because he was a man of wanting to make some money, these soldiers would hop a ride with him as he was hauling his milk. And of course he got a little extra money hauling those guys into town. And then later they moved to Tomball, and he dairied out here for a while. And he was a carpenter, built some homes, built my mother and dad's home, had built some homes in Houston too, and then ended up living in the Tomball area with my mom and dad before he passed away.
You remember where the Dudley Dairy was?
Close to Snook Lane, out in that area, as I understand. Yes.
West on Huffsmith Street.
Yes.
Across the tracks.
Yes.
I'm sorry, east. That's
East.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
East.
And this same book that I found in one of the Tomball books on your Bradigan's store had a summary of the Dudley family. So that would be your mother's family, right?
Right. That's correct. Yes.
Did the Bradigan farms have dairies, or did they farm?
They were mainly farms, yes. Then my Uncle Walter did raise cattle, though, later on his farm, I think. Yeah. I don't know that they ever dairied. I think they were just primarily farmers.
Was he raising vegetables for his store, or how did that work?
I think they raised cotton, and I think possibly corn, and that kind of thing. Because my dad mentioned, going hoeing and, keeping the weeds out of the patches, and then picking cotton. So I kind of think that's primarily what they did, yeah.
Great. Have you ever been back to Germany where the Bradigams had come from?
No, I've always wanted to do that. I really always wanted to go there and see where our roots came from. Recently did the DNA thing, and found that we were not necessarily German, but that we were United Kingdom because of course, my mother's family. There were Kellys and Dudleys, so that's English and Irish. So that's thrown into the mix. And even found we had a smidgen of Jewish blood. And so that was interesting to find that. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's more common than people think in Europe.
Yes, right.
Do you recall any traditions from Europe brought over with the Bradigan family?
Well, my grandmother was not German, and my grandfather passed away when my dad was such a young child. He was probably about 2 when he lost his dad. So there was really not that much German tradition in their household. He never did learn to speak German, but so many of his brothers and sisters did because they were raised primarily in a German household. But as far as tradition from them, I don't. I know that I've heard that you always stopped in the mid-morning and had your little, what did they call that? Where you stopped for your little treat, your mid-morning snack, but it was always something sweet with coffee probably.
One thing that was just interesting to me that I heard a lot of the German families, they started out at Salem, but then some ended up at First Baptist, some ended up at Rose Hill Methodist. So how did that happen with the families?
Yes, Rose Hill Methodist had a lot of German families there in their congregation. I'm trying to remember some names that might have been the Scholes, the Schultz family, the Beckendorfs. Yes, those families, yes, were out there at Rose Hill Methodist. Yeah, right.
Do you remember any games that y'all would play
as
with
kids?
Your friends as kids?
Yeah, you always had Red Rover. And Oh, and I love at the school, the playground equipment was so much fun. We had seesaws, we had a merry-go-round, we had swings, and it's kind of a thing, my goodness, they would never think of letting kids play with. There was several chains that would hang down from this center pole, and it had like hand grips, metal hand grips. They were heavy. You wouldn't want to be hit in the head with one of those things. But you would get those and you'd run and you'd go around in a big circle, it'd swing around on that. Then, of course, there was always jacks. Girls loved to play jacks. Boys liked to shoot marbles. And then just being fun, just having fun, make-believe. I don't know if kids know how to make-believe today or not, but pretending, pretending this and pretending that. And those were special times, yes.
Do you have any memories out around the Spring Creek Park area?
Yes, we went out there sometimes. Our class would be able to go out there for a kind of like a field day, and we had picnics, and we were not to go close to the creek. And of course, somebody always had to get in trouble. He had to go down to the creek. And yes, of course there wasn't, it was not developed like it is now today, but yes, I do remember going out there. And then some of the tragedies that happened there in that creek. So many of our young people that would jump in, and so many hard things happened. So many lost their ability to walk, after breaking a neck or something like that, because they just knew that hole was still deep, but it wasn't. It had washed and it rained, and so so there was some tragedy associated with that. I'm sorry.
I've heard some stories of some of the livestock shows that they had here in Tomball. Do you remember much about those?
Yes, I do. I do remember that, yes. Of course, the fairgrounds, as we called it, it was the North Harris County Fair, and that was down Cherry Street, and then they had buildings where the ladies could bring their cakes and their pies, and they competed. They would give ribbons for the best cake or best pie, or even canned things that they had canned, like their fruit, peaches or whatever. And so those would be on display there. And then there was a rodeo arena and a place for the people to bring their livestock to be viewed. And I'm sure Bill also had a Brahma bull that he showed there at North Harris County Fair, and he won a prize. And took it into Houston to that livestock show to show it there. But then there was the rodeo arena that stayed even after they shut down the fair, the Harris County Fair. That rodeo arena was a real popular place to go on Saturday night, and people would come, and the guys would do their ride the bulls, and that was one of Bill's favorite things to do, was ride bulls. And then there were a lot of roping activities, that they do there at that rodeo arena. Yeah.
Well, it sounded like one of the Bradinghams was involved in setting up that livestock show. Do you recall much about that?
Possibly. I would imagine that Mr. Walter, Mr. G.W., possibly had a lot to do with that, since he was a rancher. Mm-hmm. Probably so.
One of the war photos I've seen from the Bubbly collection, it looked like our mayor at the time was Mr. Ferris. Do you remember him?
Yes, Mr. Ferris, yes. Uh-huh.
And it looked like he had a pretty big waist around him.
I think he was known as the largest mayor in Texas one time. That was. And that brings up another thing. Bill decided when he decided that he'd like to lease Mr. Ferris's station, because Mr. Ferris was up in years, difficult for him to operate the station, and Bill just kind of had a desire to have his own business. So he leased Mr. Ferris's gas station for a long, long time. And Mr. Ferris's station had the old hand pump. And it would pump the gas up and into a tank at the top. And it was a glass tank or a clear tank. You could see how much gas was in there. And some people they didn't trust those electric pumps. They liked to come and buy gas from Bill because they could see how much gas was up there and how much gas drained down into their car. And they trusted that tank more than they did those new electric pumps that they had come out with.
The Tomball Hospital that I recall when I was a kid was out on Hospital Street,
Yes.
east of the railroad tracks.
Right,
But
right.
what did y'all do for hospitals before that one came in?
There wasn't a hospital. When you got really sick, you had to go into Houston, either to St. Joseph or usually St. Joseph, I recall, seems like our family visiting members of our family there in that hospital. I don't believe that Baptist Memorial had been built at that time. Then later on it was built. But yes, we had to go. And as I said, I was born all the way across Houston in a little tiny hospital on Harrisburg. And so we had no hospital. We had a few doctors here. Dr. Coker was one of our early doctors. Dr. McPhail was an early doctor here. And I believe that I recall that Rhonda said her grandfather, possibly Dr. Metzler.
Dr. Metzler. Mm-hmm. So McPhail, I remember Mrs. Calvert taught me in school, and she was a McPhail.
She was. That's right. That was her father. Right. Surely was. Yes.
And I've heard of Dr. Yagi. He had a clinic here for a while.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Right there on that same street that I can't recall, across the street from the Ball property. Yes, he did. Surely did.
Do you have memories of that Tomball Hospital on Hospital Street over there?
I do. I have some memories of that. I remember when they opened that hospital that the band got to go down and play for the opening. And I remember it was a hot, warm day. And but it was really special because our hospital was opening. And that was a really wonderful addition to our town finally. And I remember one of my children had their tonsils out there, another one had an appendectomy out there, later they added a little dental clinic also to that area. And I remember one night, one of my kiddos had a bike accident. My son Stephen had a bike accident, and we thought that we ended up there. We went there, and the little dentist was able to help him out because he knocked his teeth out with a handlebar. So, yeah, that memory.
So we had Dr. Graham there, and early on, Dr. Warren.
And Dr. Warren, yes. Yes, and they had their Graham Warren Clinic, too. Yes, yes. I remember going to see Dr. Graham and Dr. Warren also up on Main Street. They had an office up there for a while. I don't recall when that was, but I knew I took my children there to see the doctor. And that was there where the bank had formerly been Guaranty Bond Bank, and they had a doctor's office there for a while.
Remember any stories about Dr. Graham?
Oh, he was such a likable person, and one of the times he came, just a social call, there was a group that gathered at my parents' house, and they laughed because he walked in their kitchen, and he just opened the refrigerator and looked inside to see what was there, and I thought, he just made himself at home, and that was good. And so he was really he was a good doctor too. He really was a good doctor. I remember going one time, I thought I had some poison ivy, and immediately he said, "Nope, you got the shingles. I'm sorry, but you got the shingles."
Were you in the band in high school?
Yes, I was.
What did you play?
I played what they called the glockenspiel, the bells, and it was kind of like a huge lyre, and it had little bars, and you had a little mallet, so you marched, and you had to watch what you were doing and do your little bell, hit with the mallet. So I played that in the band. Yeah.
Very cool. I hadn't seen one of those in a marching band. That's
It's,
interesting.
yes, it was. I haven't seen one in years. I don't know what. I guess they gave up on those. It's kind of hard to carry around and march at the same time.
Do you remember anything about your uniforms that y'all had when you marched?
Yes, we had, when I first started in the band, which was junior high, I guess, or about that age, just the white pants and white shirt. And then later when you got in the high school band, you got to have one of those red jackets then. You could wear the red jacket. And Mr. Slack was our band director. And my, oh my, he'd try to get us to do some formations, you know, for the football games. And oh, he would get so upset with us. He would stand out there and stomp his feet, and he'd say, I'm not going to tell you what he said. But anyway, he would really get upset with our inability to make those formations like he wanted us to.
Did y'all have parades in Tomball then?
Oh, of course. Yes, there was always the parade, and got to march in the parades. Yes, that was sweet.
Did they already have the bonfire back then? Or no?
You know, I don't remember bonfires. I do not remember. I'm sure we did, but I don't recall that offhand. I surely don't.
Do you remember them later, like when your kids were in school, the bonfire there at the elementary school?
Yes, I think I do recall that. Yes, my boys played football. Both of them played football. Yeah, I do remember that. Mm-hmm.
What type of vacations did you like to go on with your family?
Well, we didn't get to do a lot of vacationing. You know, money was scarce, and so we didn't do a lot of vacationing. But I know we did make some vacations. We went up into Colorado. That always seemed to be the grandest place to go, to see the mountains. Because, you know, when you live on the flat land like we do here in Tomball, mountains are really something to see. So Colorado was a wonderful place to get to go. And so we made a few trips to Colorado. Sure did. Most of our vacationing was just spent with the family. That was our vacation.
Once your kids got older, did you work outside the home, or did you stay?
Well, actually, I started working for my parents in their store while they were still at home. And then later I worked at First Bank and Trust here in Tomball.
What did you do there?
I was in their bookkeeping department. Yes, I never did do any teller work. I always got to handle the hot checks. So that was primarily my job there at the bank.
How long did you work there?
Oh, I guess I worked about 20 years, off and on. I worked there for a while my kids were still in school, and then later on, I went back to work there, and spent the length of my time at the bank then, and continued to work in bookkeeping, filing checks, you know, and just doing the everyday little things that you did back then. Okay.
I really appreciate you coming.
Well, I
visit with
would
us
just
today.
like to just
Sure.
say this one last little thing, that how grateful I am for God's presence in the lives of our family and the gift of His Son, Jesus Christ, for our salvation.
Thank you. Well, thanks for spending the time with us today here at the museum. We appreciate your memories and your good stories of your family and Tomball. Thanks.
Thank you.